Okay, so we're just gonna do another assumption argument. So this is exam 71, section 2, question 16, assumptions. So again, when you first read the problem, you just want to highlight assumptions. So when you're going through the prompt itself, you know exactly what you're looking for. So let's go through the prompt. So at the end of 1997, several nations stated that their oil reserves had not changed since the end of 1996. But oil reserves gradually drop as oil fields are drained and rise suddenly as new oil fields are discovered. Therefore, oil reserves are unlikely to remain unchanged. So that's seems like it's going to be important, unlikely to remain unchanged from one year to the next. So most of the nations stating that their oil reserves were unchanged are probably incorrect. Most of them. So most seems pretty important too. The nations stating their reserves were unchanged. Okay, so what do we have here? So the problem is saying that oil reserves gradually drop and suddenly increase. And that means that it's unlikely that for a whole year you don't have any change, right? So before we even look at the questions, what exactly is the assumption? So the gradual, we know the oil reserves slowly go down or have sharp rises. And that means that during 1 year, you're likely to either lose oil or gain oil, but not stay the same, right? So that means that you're either going to drain more fields than you discover, or discover more fields than you drain. And so most nations who state that they have a constant balance are probably incorrect, just because it's so rare that you'd have the exact same amount of new oil discovered as you have oil that's been used up, basically. So now let's go to the questions and see what we're working with. So A, for any nation with oil reserves, it is more likely that the nation was mistaken in its statement about changes in its oil reserves. The nation's oil reserves remained unchanged. So this problem is strong, right? So it has for any nation with oil reserves, but we're not talking about any nation with oil reserves. We're just talking about the several nations who stated that their oil reserves had not changed. So this one has that as an issue, right? But we're not going to mark it off because it's still pretty strong. Because everything below that makes some level of sense. So more likely that the nation was mistaken in its statements, which is right. So most of the nations are probably incorrect, right? So mistaken. Then the nation's oil reserves remain unchanged. So everything below that makes sense. It's just this first part here where it goes for any nation with oil reserves, which is kind of outside of the scope of our problem. So let's look at B. It is likely that in 1997, most of the nations that stated that their oil reserves were unchanged, old oil fields were drained or new oil fields were discovered, or both. So B makes some level of sense, right? Because, so also the problem with A, sorry, just real quick, going back to this, is goes, so most of the nations were unchanged are probably incorrect. So most of them are probably incorrect, which means that it's possible that some of them are correct, which this also has an issue with, although it just says it's more likely that the nation was mistaken. So I guess the more the problem happens with the first issue. It's likely in 1997, most of the nations stated their oil reserves were unchanged. Oil fields were drained, or new oil fields discovered, not both. So B is a pretty good answer, mostly because it's just, so it's within the scope, right? Most of the nations stated oil reserves were unchanged. It's within the scope. And it says kind of the same thing that this does, right? In that the fact that new fields are drained and old fields are discovered means that reaching equilibrium again is going to be pretty difficult. It's pretty difficult to get 10 fields discovered and 10 fields drained. It's way more likely that you have 9 and 8 or some other random number like that, but it's very rare that X and Y equal each other essentially. There with X being number of oil fields drained and Y being number of new oil fields discovered. So during the course of 1997, the oil reserves for at least one nation did not gradually drop, but also rose suddenly. So C doesn't really have anything to do with what we're talking about, right? We care about whether the oil reserves were unchanged. The fact that of at least one nation not only gradually dropped but also rose could still mean that they all reach equilibrium, right? So for example, if for the first 10 months they go down 1 every month, or whatever, one unit, and then in the last 2 months, they both go up, they go up 5 units. That still means that they're at the same place as they were, right? Because for the first 10 months, they went down 1 each month, which gives us 10. And for the last 2 months of the year, they went up 5 each time, which gives us 10 again. And then we're still at equilibrium, but we're trying to show that they're mistaken, that they're incorrect. So they can't be at equilibrium, which C does not help us do. D, if a nation incorrectly stated at the end of 1997 that its oil reserves did not change since the end of 1996, then during 1997, that nation drained its oil fields and discovered new ones. So D is somewhat correct, right? In that, so it talks about the nation incorrectly stated, right? So it's within the scope. But here it says that then during that nation drained its oil fields and discovered new ones. But it could still do it to where it discovers 10 new oil fields and it drains 10 of its old oil fields and discovers 10 new ones, and it still puts us back in equilibrium, which is not what we're looking for, right? We're looking for something that makes equilibrium unlikely. So this one, for example, right, gives us old oil fields where, so let's take old, new, or both, right? So let's say 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. In the 2/3 where old oil fields were drained or new oil fields were discovered, equilibrium is not achieved, right? Which is what we're looking for, and that most of these nations are incorrect. Most of the nations say that they have equilibrium are incorrect, which is why B still seems to be where we're leaning towards. So let's look at E. If a nation's oil reserves change from 1 year to the next, that nation is obligated to report the change correctly. So E's problem is it's more of an ethical dilemma than a practical issue, is what E's dealing with, right? Whether they're obligated to. So the first thing is we don't really know that in the problem, because the problem is more practical based. But secondly, even if they are obligated to, they could still be incorrect, right? They could just they could have just misreported it on accident, or they might just not have good record keeping in that country, or whatever the issue is, which kind of gets rid of E because it's not necessarily practical what we're talking about, which leaves us with A and B. And again, B is going to be the better answer purely because of the scope issue. So A would be like the second best answer. But it's A is for any nation with oil reserves, versus B is most of the nations that stated their oil reserves were unchanged, which is what we're talking about. So B is going to be the stronger answer there. Let's check our answer. B is this.